20 years of wrongful imprisonment. A fierce black woman, with eyes blazing with determination, is locked away by a ruthless, corrupt judge in the heart of Atlanta, a city that has witnessed decades of bloodshed and tears shed for racial injustice. In the darkness of the prison, she silently prepares a devastating counterattack to expose his dirty money empire. Can she alone shatter that corrupt system with her unrelenting truth, or will she forever be buried in the nightmare of those in power? The gavel slammed down with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the room like the final toll of a bell, a fate sealed and impossible to escape. Judge Malcolm Hayes sat high upon his elevated seat, his cold, steely eyes narrowing as they gazed down at the woman before him. The expression on his face was one of utter indifference, as though he were simply delivering a routine judgment. His voice rang out, slicing through the tense silence, his words harsh and final. 20 years in prison. His tone was devoid of any emotion, the sheer weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. For a split second, the room seemed to freeze. Time itself came to a grinding halt as the magnitude of what had just been said sank in. The walls of the courtroom, which had witnessed countless injustices over the years, now seemed to tremble with the very weight of history repeating itself. From the back of the room, a broken sob shattered the silence. Lena Harper's mother, the elderly woman, collapsed forward, her frail hands gripping the edge of the seat as if they could somehow anchor her in the face of this unspeakable horror. Her body trembled violently, as though the very foundation of her soul had been torn apart. Some of the spectators, their faces drawn tight with grief, looked away, unable to witness the devastation. Others, their faces contorted with a mix of disbelief and anger, looked on helplessly. But regardless of who was watching, they all felt a sharp sting of injustice cut through them like a blade. This wasn't just a sentence. It was a declaration of war against an entire community, an entire legacy of pain. But in the midst of the chaos, the murmurs of disbelief and fear rippling through the crowd, Lena Harper stood tall. Her spine was straight, her shoulders squared. Not a flicker of fear crossed her face. Her eyes, intense and unyielding, locked onto Judge Hayes with a ferocity that seemed to challenge the very foundation of his power. The arrogance that had once radiated from his smug face now seemed to falter, just for a moment. Not a single tear fell from Lena's face, not one, despite the weight of the injustice that had been thrust upon her, despite the decades of her life stolen in a blink of an eye. She stood unwavering, her gaze burning with a quiet fury that spoke louder than any words ever could. Her lips barely parted, but the faintest of smiles tugged at the corners of her mouth, a smile that seemed to mock the courtroom, the judge, the entire system. It was a smile that sent a chill down the spine of every person present, including Malcolm Hayes himself. The judge's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He tried to suppress the unease creeping through him, but it was impossible to ignore. The air in the room had thickened, as though the weight of Lena's defiance had infected everything that had been so carefully controlled in this courtroom. Lena Harper did not break. She did not cower or beg like so many had before her. Instead, she simply stood there, her eyes still locked onto the judge's, unwavering, relentless, and filled with a challenge so fierce, so unapologetic, that it sent ripples of discomfort through the room. Malcolm Hayes, for the first time in years, felt the faintest tremor of doubt creep into his thoughts. This woman, sentenced to 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment, should have been begging for mercy. She should have been pleading for the smallest shred of compassion, like so many others had before her. But she wasn't. She was staring him down, not with defeat, but with a silent promise that this was far from over. The courtroom, which had held its breath during the sentencing, now held its collective gasp as Lena stood there, unmoving, an embodiment of defiance in the face of everything that had conspired against her. It was as if she had taken all the oppression, all the years of suffering, and transformed it into a quiet, unyielding strength that could not be crushed, no matter how hard they tried. In a far corner of the room, a young reporter, his hands trembling as he scribbled frantically in his notepad, felt the weight of the moment. He knew with every fiber of his being that this was not just another day in the courtroom. This was history in the making. This was the moment when everything changed. Lena Harper had been crushed by the system, by the very institution meant to uphold justice, but she had not fallen. Instead, she had become something greater than the sum of her suffering. She had become a symbol of resistance, a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and in doing so, she had shaken the very foundation of that system to its core. Lena Harper walked slowly across the cold stone floor, her wrists shackled tightly, but her gaze remained as sharp as a blade, cutting through everything around her. She felt the suffocating air in the courtroom, the sense that this space had become thick with tension and pain. Despite being bound by rusty chains, she still held herself with an air of dignity, as if those shackles could never contain the steel resolve inside her. Each step she took felt like a bold statement to everyone in the room, for everyone witnessing this moment. No one could believe that an unjust sentence had just been passed, and no one could do a thing to stop it. Some people bowed their heads, unable to face the heartbreaking scene unfolding before them. Others clenched their fists in silent rage, as though the pain was echoing through their own chests. But only one person dared to hold her head high in the darkest moment of her life, and that person was Lena. She didn't bow, she didn't weep, she didn't beg for mercy. She just stood there, unwavering, as if nothing could break her. As she passed the judge's bench, she slightly tilted her head and glanced at Malcolm Hayes, her eyes flashing with a coldness like the edge of a steel blade honed over the years. He, the man who had sentenced her, tried to appear calm, but in that fleeting moment, Lena saw the hesitation pass across his face. She didn't need to speak a word, didn't need to do anything more, but in her mind, one thought rang out like a solemn vow to her fate. This is not the end. This is the beginning of your bloodshed and tears. The officers escorting her had no idea that the woman they were dragging away was not a desperate soul, but a warrior silently preparing for a great battle. 2 years ago, when she realized that the system could not protect people like her, she had delved deep into the shadows where men like Hayes manipulated everything through money, power, and threats. She had tracked him, every bribery ring, every envelope hastily shoved into the hands of corrupt officials, every threat sent to those daring to defy him. She saw the victims he had pushed into the abyss, lives destroyed simply for refusing to bow. Every fragment of that rotten picture did not break her. Instead, it only sharpened her into a razor's edge, not easily bent or broken. In the darkness, she had learned how to fight. She wasn't waiting for pity. She wasn't relying on the judgments of those who lacked the courage to rise. She had learned that only she could change her own destiny, and that was why she wasn't afraid now. That blade was ready. She stepped through the courthouse door, the light outside making her squint slightly, but within her, a storm was rising. The people around her might think she had been defeated. They might think she would quietly accept her fate. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. The seed of justice had been planted, and it would erupt into a storm that no one could extinguish. In the prison's darkness, where she would face the harshest of challenges, Lena wouldn't just face the pain of loss. She would face the very injustice that had crushed so many others. Yet she knew that every day, every moment in this prison brought her one step closer to the vengeance she had planned for so long. With relentless perseverance and a burning desire for justice, Lena had become a woman who could not be defeated. And what those in the courtroom didn't know was that in her eyes, the waves of anger and the hunger for justice had begun to rise, and that would never stop until they paid for their wrongs. With each step she took, she grew stronger because she knew she would not be alone in this fight. Those who had been destroyed by the system would stand with her, and the threats from those in power would no longer be barriers. They had misjudged her, and now she would make them pay for that mistake. The storm of justice was coming, and no one could stop it. The heavy clang of the iron door slamming shut behind Lena Harper reverberated down the long, barren hallway of the prison. It sounded like a death knell marking the end of her freedom. The air in the facility was thick with humidity, suffocating and pungent with the scent of rust, as if the very walls of this place had absorbed the suffering of every soul that had passed through. The guards standing stiffly along either side of the hallway kept their eyes cold, empty, their expressions unreadable. But beneath their stoic facades, there was an undeniable sense of malice, like a predator watching its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One of them, a hulking brute with a face covered in scars, grinned slightly as he shoved her into the cell. His voice was low and gravelly, like the sound of an old door creaking under pressure. "Welcome to hell, Harper." Lena did not flinch. She didn't answer his taunt. She just walked into the cold, dimly lit room, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The four walls of the cell, thick with age and neglect, pressed in on her. The flickering light above cast weak shadows on the stone floor, cold and unforgiving. The bed was nothing more than a metal frame with a thin, tattered mattress that seemed to be nothing but fabric stretched over steel. The sink was rusted and barely functional. This was a place designed to break you, to strip away your humanity. But Lena had been prepared for this. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. These walls, these oppressive, suffocating surroundings, were nothing compared to what she had already survived. But she knew that in this place, her true enemies would not be just the stone walls. Hours passed. The silence of the cell felt almost unbearable, the weight of time pressing down on her as she sat on the hard bed, her thoughts racing. Then the trap was sprung. A sudden scream echoed from the hallway, cutting through the stillness, followed by the sound of heavy boots pounding against the concrete floor. The door to her cell was thrown open with a force that made the old hinges groan. Two guards stormed in, their eyes gleaming with malicious intent. One of them, the scarred giant, grabbed her mattress and ripped it off the frame with an unsettling amount of force. The other, smaller but no less menacing, pulled out a small, gleaming knife, its edge catching the dim light in a way that made it seem all too dangerous. "Found it," the second guard said, his voice dripping with feigned enthusiasm, almost as if he were enjoying the act of humiliating her. He held up the knife as if it were some trophy of their twisted little game. Lena's heart beat steadily in her chest. She had been expecting this. She knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to fabricate something, anything, to trap her further, to keep her locked away in this nightmare for even longer. This was their plan. They wanted to make her another statistic, to bury her under a pile of false accusations, to silence her, to break her. But Lena was not like the other prisoners. She had survived far worse than this. She had lived through the kind of pain that could tear a person apart, and yet she stood here, unbroken. She stared straight at the guard holding the knife, her eyes dark with defiance, her expression calm. The gaze she gave him was not one of fear, but one of steady determination. She wasn't afraid of the knife in his hand, nor of the threats he made. For a moment, the guard hesitated. He froze, his hand wavering just slightly. There was something in Lena's eyes, something unyielding, something far more terrifying than fear itself. It was the calm of a person who had already faced death and come out stronger on the other side. "Don't play the fool." Lena's voice was steady, low, and as cold as the steel they wielded. "You know it's not mine." The guard sneered, but his smile faltered slightly. The confidence in his demeanor began to slip, just a little. Lena Harper was not like the others. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't begging for mercy. She stood there, still as a mountain, unflinching, a flicker of defiance burning in her eyes. And in that moment, as the seconds stretched on, a quiet wave of unease rippled through the guards. They were beginning to realize that Lena Harper was not someone they could easily crush. The larger guard, still holding the knife, finally took a step back. His eyes flicked to the other guard, who was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The tension in the room grew thicker, as if they too felt the weight of what they were dealing with. Lena had become a force to be reckoned with, even within the confines of these stone walls. In the darkness of the prison, Lena didn't just exist as a prisoner. She had already begun to carve out her place here, to turn her imprisonment into something far greater than herself. Her mind raced with thoughts, with plans, with the resolve to not only survive this nightmare, but to dismantle it piece by piece. The guards may have thought they could break her, but they had underestimated her. As the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her back in her cell, Lena's eyes remained steady, burning with a fire that would never be extinguished. Her enemies thought they had won, that they had broken her spirit, but they were wrong. This was just the beginning, and Lena Harper would make sure they all knew that. As the night crept in, the prison descended into a dangerous, unnerving silence. The air grew thick with tension, the kind of stillness that seemed to press down on the walls. The only sounds were the slow, deliberate footsteps of the guards echoing from the far end of the corridor and the occasional metallic clang as the iron bars rattled with their movements. But within the dim confines of Lena's narrow cell, a conversation of monumental weight was taking place. Across from her, sitting on the hard bed in the far corner, was Grace, an elderly woman whose silver hair was thin and wild, her hands gnarled with age and hardship. Grace had been here for far too long, a silent witness to the countless lives that had been swallowed whole by this merciless place. Her eyes, once full of life, were now deep pools of sorrow, void of the sparkle that hope once brought. But when Grace looked at Lena, there was something different, something faintly stirring within her old heart. "You have the eyes of warriors from days long gone," Grace whispered hoarsely, her voice rough from years of disuse but still strong, carrying the weight of lived experience. "The eyes of those who never bow down, who stand tall even when the world is set to crush them." Lena remained still, her gaze locked onto Grace. She knew the truth behind those words, the weight they carried, but she didn't have time for memories or sentimentality. She had only one goal in mind: survival and revenge. For a long moment, Lena said nothing. The silence between them felt as heavy as the prison wall surrounding them. But finally, with a sharp intake of breath, Lena leaned forward slightly, her posture commanding attention, her eyes as cold and determined as a blade forged in fire. "I won't stay here forever," Lena spoke, her voice steady and filled with resolve. There was no trace of the fear that the prison had trained into so many others. Her words were not a plea for sympathy, but a declaration of her own unbreakable will. "I have a plan. I've been watching him for a long time. I know how to bring Malcolm Hayes down, but I can't do it alone. I need help." Grace didn't speak immediately. Her weathered face remained unreadable, her eyes narrowing as she processed Lena's words. She had lived too long in this nightmare to trust anyone easily. Too many people had come and gone, promising revolution, offering hope, only to be broken by the very system they sought to defy. But Lena's resolve was different. There was a fire in her eyes that Grace hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, Grace's mind wandered back to her own younger days, when she had once believed in the possibility of change. But those days were long gone. The prison had eaten away at that hope, leaving nothing but a quiet, resigned acceptance of her fate. But Lena was different. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Grace's lips curled into a faint smile, weak yet filled with something deeper, a spark, a memory of defiance from days gone by. "He's done too much hurt, too many, pushed too many of us into the dirt without a second thought. If you really can bring him down, then I'll help you." Lena's eyes never left Grace's. In that moment, an unspoken bond was formed between them. It was a fragile thing, like the faintest flicker of a candle in the dark, but it was enough. Enough to light the way through the darkness, to make the impossible feel within reach. In the oppressive silence of the cell, as the night stretched on, a promise was made. A small spark of rebellion was lit, buried deep in the hearts of two women trapped in a world of injustice. And when that spark caught fire, when it truly ignited, it would spread through these walls like a storm, impossible to contain. No prison, no guard, no corrupt system could ever put it out. Lena sat back, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the enemies she would face were powerful, but for the first time since her wrongful imprisonment, a sense of purpose filled her chest. And as the prison settled into its suffocating quiet, the faintest sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the hallways. Outside, the guards marched, unaware of the storm that was quietly stirring within the walls of their fortress. When Lena Harper's plan began to unfold, nothing in this prison would ever be the same again. The sound of the gavel echoed in his mind like an unending nightmare. Lena Harper had been thrown into prison, but why couldn't he shake this unsettling feeling? Malcolm Hayes leaned back in his chair, his fingers idly swirling the expensive glass of whiskey in his hand, but it did little to mask the tension creeping into every muscle. How many people had he dealt with before? How many had bowed their heads before him? How many lives had he crushed with his own hands? But none of them were like Lena Harper. He had seen her eyes in the courtroom. No regret, no fear, no desperation. She stood there unmoved, as if she didn't believe in the verdict, didn't believe in his power. And then that smile that had shaken him to his core. It wasn't one of mockery, it wasn't one of submission. It was a warning. He took a gulp of whiskey, but his hand trembled slightly as he set the glass down. Why did he still feel like she was watching him, even though she was behind bars? Hayes clenched his fist, his eyes narrowing with a sharp, cold gleam. He couldn't let this go on. He needed to uncover her past, needed to find her weakness. She couldn't just be some ordinary woman. She had to have a secret, something that could suffocate her before she had the chance to rise up. He picked up the phone, his voice dropping, each word cold and sharp like a blade. "Jasper, I need you to do something for me." On the other end of the line, Jasper Kane, the man who had handled Hayes's most delicate problems in the past, let out a dry, hollow laugh. "Let me guess, the fearless little girl." Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, his gaze turning dark. "I want everything about her. Peel back every layer. Turn over every stone. I want to know what made that monster." Jasper snorted, but he knew this wasn't just another casual request. Hayes was not the type to panic easily, but this time, Lena Harper had gotten under his skin, and that wasn't a good sign for anyone involved in this game. 3 days later, Jasper Kane walked into the office, slamming a stack of files onto the table. It wasn't the file about Lena's crimes. It was about her true identity. Hayes opened it, his eyes scanning over the pages, his expression slowly changing. Then he laughed, a deep, drawn-out laugh echoing through the room like someone who had just revealed their trump card. But beneath the laughter, there was a fear rising in him because now he knew. Lena Harper wasn't just a victim of the system. She was a storm waiting for the day she would sweep everything away. The darkness enveloped the prison, with only the faint yellow light casting a sickly glow down the long, winding hallway. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed, slow but filled with deathly intent. Jasper Kane, Hayes's loyal enforcer, was not the type to hesitate in the face of anyone. He had dealt with countless troublesome individuals for this system, and tonight, he had a crucial task: to break Lena Harper. The cell door slammed open with such force that the hinges groaned in protest. Lena didn't need to look to know who had entered. She remained seated, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, her eyes icy as a glacier, yet they still carried an ember of fire, barely contained. Jasper leaned down, his rough hands grabbing her by the collar, jerking her up violently. "Who the hell do you think you are, Harper?" he snarled, his breath reeking of whiskey and cigarettes. "You think you can defy this system?" Lena didn't respond, didn't struggle. She simply stared into his eyes, a look that caused Jasper to lose control for a brief, fleeting moment. He clenched his fist, then threw a punch straight into her face. Her head snapped to the side. A streak of blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. But she didn't budge. Not a sound, not a flicker of pain showed on her face. Jasper ground his teeth, his hand yanking her hair, pulling her face close to his. "Speak up. What the hell are you hiding? I know you have a plan. If you don't tell me right now, I'll make you wish you were never born." Lena spat out a mouthful of blood, the corner of her lips curving into a small, taunting smile. "You'll die by my hands before I ever fall." Her voice was low, but every word struck like a dagger into Jasper's pride. For a brief moment, his hand froze. She wasn't afraid of him, not in the slightest. People like Lena, those who had been trampled for far too long, had nothing left to lose, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. Jasper stepped back, confused by the sudden rush of sweat on his palms. She wasn't like the others. She didn't break, didn't beg. She was a true threat. Just a few hours later, he returned to Hayes's office, his face pale, still shaken by the lingering confusion. He stood before the desk, his hands clenched tight, as if he wanted to crush everything in his fury. "She didn't say a word," he growled, but deep inside, something gnawed at him harder than the failure itself. An unease simmered. For the first time, he felt something was wrong. Hayes set his whiskey glass down, his eyes narrowing. "Didn't say a word?" Jasper swallowed hard, his voice dropping as if he couldn't even believe what he was about to say. "No," she smiled. Lena Harper sat against the cold, unforgiving stone wall of her cell, her breath coming in heavy, labored gasps. The taste of blood still fresh on her lips from the brutal torture she'd endured at the hands of Jasper. The pain from every inch of her battered body was like a constant, gnawing reminder of how long she'd been crushed by the system. Yet it didn't matter. Pain didn't break her. It only fueled her resolve. Her eyes flickered toward the small, filthy window, the hallway beyond swallowed by darkness. But Lena knew this was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. Mrs. Grace had quietly spread the word to every corner of this hellhole, and the prisoners who had been broken for so long were now ready to rise. The time had come. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms, then nodded slightly at the woman sitting across from her. Mrs. Grace didn't say a word, but the silent exchange of a single nod spoke volumes, a shared understanding of what was about to unfold. Then, the sound of chaos erupted from the kitchen. The fire had been started intentionally, a distraction, and the smoke billowed thick and suffocating as it filled the narrow hallways. A guard's frantic orders echoed, telling others to extinguish the flames. But to Lena, this was the sign. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. Mrs. Grace's voice came low, urgent. Now or never. Lena didn't hesitate. The second the door to her cell swung open, she was already moving. A prisoner had snatched the keys from a careless guard, and with them, they had set the stage for what was to come. The storm had begun. The blaring alarm echoed shrill and deafening, but it was drowned out by the guttural roars of those who had suffered in silence for too long. A guard charged at her, swinging his baton in a wide arc, but Lena was quicker than he anticipated. She pivoted effortlessly, dodging the swing, and with a flash of fury, slammed a fist straight into his throat. The guard gasped, his body freezing for a moment as the air was knocked from his lungs, and his wide eyes bulged with panic. He staggered back, hands clutching at his throat, but Lena wasn't done. She followed up with a brutal, savage kick to his knee, sending him crashing to the concrete floor with a sickening thud, like a rag doll falling from a great height. Her heart pounded in her chest as she bent down, her eyes scanning the chaos around her. Her hand snatched up a shard of glass from the shattered window, its edge sharp and glinting in the dim light. In that moment, Lena became more than just a prisoner. She became a force of nature. The smoke, the screams, the shouts of pain and rage, it all blurred together as her blood boiled with a single thought: revenge. The weight of everything she had endured, the humiliation, the years stolen, the way Hayes had crushed her, thinking her weak, thinking her broken, it all surged within her, an uncontrollable fire ready to burn everything in its path. She held the shard of glass like a weapon, her grip tightening until her knuckles went white. The guards were being overrun, the control system on the verge of collapse. Lena knew this was her only shot. If she didn't take action now, if she didn't destroy everything standing in her way, then the system would crush her again. There would be no second chances. She spun on her heel, her eyes locking with Mrs. Grace one last time, a single silent acknowledgement of what they were about to do. And then, without hesitation, she strode into the storm, her heart racing but her mind clear. This wasn't just a rebellion. This was her reckoning. This was her path to freedom, and no one, nothing, would stop her. Lena Harper hurtled down the narrow hallway, a shadow racing through the chaos. Her body screamed in agony with every step, yet she pushed forward relentlessly. Blood soaked her shirt, the sweat from her exertion mixing with the sting of the open wound in her shoulder. The sound of the alarm still blared from distant corridors, sharp and relentless, mingling with the cacophony of screams and the thunderous explosions that rattled the walls. The dim lights overhead flickered, casting fleeting shadows that danced across the walls like specters in a horror film. Ahead of her, a guard appeared from around the corner, his gun raised, his eyes narrowing in determination. But Lena didn't hesitate, not for a second. There was no fear, no second-guessing. She was a force of nature, a woman who had endured too much to back down now. She charged at him with all the fury she had, the shard of glass in her hand gleaming in the dim light. The first shot rang out. A searing pain slashed across her shoulder, the bullet grazing her flesh and drawing a dark red streak down her body. Blood poured from the wound, soaking through her clothes, but she barely felt it. The pain only pushed her harder. With a roar of defiance, Lena collided with the guard, sending them both crashing to the floor. The sharp metallic scent of blood filled the air as they tumbled together, her fingers still clutching the glass shard. She didn't waste a second. Her knee pressed down hard on his chest, pinning him to the floor as she wrested the gun from his hand. The guard's eyes widened in disbelief as she gripped the weapon, but she didn't shoot. She threw it aside, letting it clatter uselessly on the cold concrete. With swift, savage movements, Lena slammed her fist into his temple, over and over, until his body went limp, his breath no longer a threat. She didn't wait for him to stir. No time to hesitate. No time to wonder if the chaos behind her would swallow her whole. Lena stood up, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she could feel the heat of freedom just ahead. Blood dripped from her shoulder, but she couldn't afford to stop, not now. Every step felt like an eternity, the weight of each move adding to the burning fire inside her. The door ahead was the only thing that mattered. She pushed on, the shrill wail of the alarm still echoing in her ears, a constant reminder of the system that had tried to break her, of the cruel men who thought they could keep her caged. But she was done being caged. Her eyes focused solely on the heavy metal door ahead, its rusted frame stark against the chaos of the hallway. Beyond that door was freedom, or so she hoped. Beyond that door could be the chance for her to escape at all, or it could be her end. Armed guards could be waiting, ready to shoot her down the second she stepped into the open. But she had no choice. She couldn't stop now. She pushed through the pain, the blood, the fear. Her heart thundered in her chest, and her legs felt like they might collapse beneath her, but she refused to give in. The shard of glass still gripped tightly in her hand. She didn't stop running. She wasn't just running from prison, from them. She was running from everything that had tried to crush her, from the years of torment and suffering. As she neared the door, her entire body screamed for rest, but she ignored it. The door loomed ahead, barely a few feet away, its metal edges rough and jagged with age, its surface slick with years of grime. Lena didn't slow down. Every step, every breath was a battle, but she kept moving forward. Then she reached it. Her hand shot out, grabbing the cold, rusted handle, and with one final, desperate twist, she yanked the door open. For a moment, the world outside was nothing but a blur of bright light and open space. But before she could take another breath, she heard the sound of boots pounding toward her. The guards. Her pulse raced, but she wasn't going to stop. Not now, not when she had come so far. Her escape was a nightmare, a path strewn with blood, pain, and danger, but every inch, every second, only made her more certain. She could hear them closing in, the sound of shouts and footsteps growing louder, but the thought of the open sky, the promise of freedom, pushed her onward. Lena Harper had come too far to be stopped now. She could feel it in her bones. The taste of victory was so close, and there was no turning back. No one would take this moment from her. The door had opened, the storm had started, and Lena was ready to face whatever came next. As the first light of day broke through the towering skyscrapers of Atlanta, thousands of people filled the streets, converging in front of the courthouse. The crowd was a sea of faces spanning all ages, but most notably, it was filled with older black men and women, people who had lived a lifetime under the brutal weight of systemic injustice and racial discrimination. They stood there, initially in hushed silence, holding signs that read boldly, "Justice for Lena." The story of Lena Harper had burst from the confines of the prison, carried by the strength of Mrs. Grace, a woman who had lived long enough to understand that sometimes the truth must be shouted. It was Grace who had secretly sent a letter to a young reporter, someone who not only took the information but exposed it for the world to see, igniting a fire in the hearts of the public. The newspapers didn't merely recount Lena's daring escape. They told the story of the broken system, of the iron-fisted tyranny of Hayes. The press had exposed it all, the corruption, the abuse, the souls destroyed by the system that had failed them for too long. And it set the public on fire. Outside the courthouse, the murmurs started quietly, like the rumble of a distant storm. Then, as if the collective breath of the oppressed had been held for too long, the whispers turned into shouts, louder and stronger with each passing moment. "Justice for Lena! Justice for Lena!" The voices of the elderly, raw and hoarse from years of shouting in vain against oppression, now joined together in a deafening chorus of fury. The words didn't just echo for Lena. They echoed for everyone who had ever suffered under the same cruel hand. The banners waved in the wind, their colors bright against the morning sky. But it wasn't just the banners that caught the eye. It was the people. The tears that streamed down the faces of those who had witnessed bloodshed, who had lived through decades of protest crushed by the heel of power. They had lived in silence for far too long, but today was different. Today, they were no longer afraid. They were tired of bowing their heads, tired of being silenced, tired of asking for justice and being denied over and over. Today, they were not only standing for Lena, they were standing for themselves, for every single soul who had ever been denied a voice, every life that had been crushed under the weight of the system that had always protected the powerful and silenced the weak. The sun, which had risen over the horizon, seemed to burn brighter than ever, casting golden rays across the crowd below. But as the light bathed them, the rage in the crowd began to grow hotter and fiercer, like a storm breaking loose. The air was thick with the tension of years of built-up frustration, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths, of generations of people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and dehumanized. Lena, wherever she was, could feel it. She could hear their voices rising in solidarity, feel their energy coursing through her veins, even though she was miles away. Their shouts were not just for her. They were for every wronged person who had ever been cast aside. Lena knew that even though she stood alone in her fight, she wasn't truly alone anymore. She had a whole city, no, a whole movement behind her. And that fire in her heart burned brighter now than it ever had before. She could hear the rage of the crowd, the roar of defiance, and she knew this was only the beginning. They had awakened something far bigger than herself, something that could no longer be ignored. The fight for justice was no longer just her own. It was theirs. It wasn't just a rebellion. It was a movement, and nothing would stop it now. Inside the lavish office, the walls adorned with opulent furnishings and the faint scent of expensive cologne, Malcolm Hayes paced relentlessly, his steps echoing off the marble floor. His fingers were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were stark white, the tension in his body radiating like a storm ready to burst. The TV screen in front of him continued to flash images of the protest unfolding outside the Atlanta courthouse. The faces of the protesters were filled with fury, their eyes burning with the rawness of injustice long endured. Their fists were raised high, gripping signs that boldly read, "Justice for Lena." The chants of the crowd, "Justice for Lena, justice for Lena," pounded through the air, cutting through the stillness of the room like the relentless beating of a war drum. The flickering light of the TV screen cast a cold, eerie glow over his face, but the growing noise from outside seemed to press in on him, suffocating him. The room, once a sanctuary of power and control, seemed to close in around him. He could feel the walls tightening with every passing second. His grip on the back of his chair tightened, his jaw clenched as if he were trying to hold himself together. "Shut it down," Hayes barked, his voice rough with panic, his eyes wild as he turned to Jasper Kane standing by the door. His bloodshot eyes were filled with desperation. "Find a way. Bribe the media, threaten, silence them. I don't care, just make it stop." His voice cracked slightly at the end, betraying the sheer terror building inside him. His entire empire, the control he had fought so hard to establish, was now slipping through his fingers. Lena's defiance had ignited a fire that he could not extinguish. Jasper stood still for a moment, not responding immediately. He could feel the tension thickening in the air. This was not the calm, calculating Hayes he had worked with for years. This was a man on the verge of losing everything. The Hayes he knew had never panicked. The Hayes he knew was a man who controlled everything, his world, his power, his reputation. But now, in the face of this uprising, this unexpected rebellion, something was unraveling. "I've told you already, Jasper," Hayes shouted again, but this time his voice wavered, a tremor of fear seeping through. His hands clenched so tightly around the armrest of the chair that his knuckles looked like they might crack. He was no longer the man who issued cold, final judgments with a detached air. He was a man desperate to hold on to something, anything, before everything fell apart. Jasper's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he saw something in Hayes that he had never seen before, raw vulnerability. The man who had spent years building an empire through manipulation and control now found himself fighting to keep his grip on a system that was spiraling beyond his control. Jasper slowly nodded, his movements deliberate, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. Hayes's desperation was all too clear. His command to silence the protesters, his demand to stifle the truth, was born not from authority, but from fear. Jasper turned to leave the room, his footsteps echoing louder than ever in the now oppressive silence. He knew that the world was shifting beneath their feet. Outside, the crowd was growing, their voices becoming a tidal wave of rage and frustration. Hayes could feel it too. He stood frozen, staring at the screen, his breathing shallow, his fists trembling slightly. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just a public relations nightmare, a protest that could be quelled with enough resources and threats. This was something more dangerous, something that threatened to undo everything he had built, everything he had worked for. As the sound of the crowd continued to reverberate in his ears, Hayes's mind raced. The walls of the prison were closing in around him, and not just the literal walls of the courthouse, but the walls of his entire power structure. The uprising was no longer just about Lena Harper. It was about every soul that had been crushed under the weight of his system. Every protester, every person standing outside the courthouse, was a symbol of something that had been ignored for too long, a force that, like a wave crashing over a dam, was now unstoppable. His eyes flicked to the TV once more, watching as the protest escalated, the crowd growing more determined with each passing minute. The image of the protesters, their faces fierce and unwavering, burned into his mind. Lena's face flashed in his mind, the defiance in her eyes a reminder of how little control he had left. He had tried to suppress her, tried to break her, but now she had become the spark that had set everything ablaze. Hayes ran a shaky hand through his hair, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. His empire was crumbling piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His hands clenched tighter, but the more he gripped, the more helpless he felt. The fire was out of his control. He couldn't extinguish it. It had already spread too far. In that moment, Hayes realized something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge before. The world had changed, and it was slipping out of his hands. The door to the cell creaked open, its hinges protesting with a shrill sound that echoed through the narrow corridor. Lena Harper's sharp eyes flickered to the figure standing in the doorway. Through the dim light that barely illuminated the space, she saw him. Agent Ethan Cole, standing tall, his expression cold and calculating. His gaze was sharp, unwavering, but beneath it, Lena could sense a quiet determination. He had come back. She didn't need to ask why or how. She knew this was it. The moment had arrived. "We have only a few minutes," Ethan said swiftly, his voice low and urgent. His eyes swept across the hallway, making sure the coast was clear. "I've bribed one of the guards. He'll lead us to the back gate. After that, everything depends on you." Lena didn't speak, just nodded. There was no time for words. Her mind was focused, clear as it had been in the moments before every battle she'd ever fought. She ripped a strip from the corner of her tattered prison shirt, wrapping it tightly around the wound on her shoulder, feeling the familiar sting of it still healing. But the pain was nothing. She had endured worse. And right now, her only focus was getting out, getting revenge, freedom. Without a second glance, Lena moved quickly, following Ethan through the winding, narrow hallways. Every step felt heavier, but it didn't matter. There was only one direction to go, forward. No words passed between them. Only the sound of their hurried footsteps echoed against the concrete floor, each step building to the inevitable moment of confrontation. As they approached the back gate, Ethan stopped suddenly, his hand raised a signal for her to hide. The hallway was dark, and the sounds of the outside world were muffled by the thick walls around them. "Wait for the signal," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. Lena looked up at him, her eyes burning with a fire that was more intense than anything she had ever felt. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment everything would change. Ethan gave a quick nod, then disappeared into the shadows, leaving Lena standing alone in the stillness. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as she stood there, her breathing slow and controlled. She knew the risks. If they were caught now, everything would be over. But there was no turning back. Not now, not after everything she had endured. And then, in the distance, a deafening explosion shattered the silence. The walls around them trembled with the force of it, the shock wave rattling the very foundations of the prison. Smoke billowed into the air, thick and choking, while debris rained down from the walls and ceiling. The sound of the explosion echoed for what felt like an eternity, but in the midst of the chaos, Lena's pulse quickened. This was the signal. Without a moment's hesitation, Lena charged from her hiding spot, her legs moving faster than she had ever run before. The air around her was thick with dust, and the acrid smell of smoke burned in her nostrils. But she didn't stop, not even for a second. Ethan had thought he knew Lena Harper, had thought he understood her strength and her resolve. But as he watched her run through the smoke-filled hallways, cutting through the chaos with a speed and focus that seemed almost supernatural, he realized how wrong he had been. In the midst of the destruction, with the world around her falling apart, Lena was like a force of nature, unstoppable and fierce. Her movements were swift, calculated, each one leading her closer to the freedom she had longed for. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but there was no fear. There was only determination. The air around her was thick with the sounds of alarms blaring, the desperate shouts of guards scrambling to regain control, but none of it mattered. Lena was running toward her future, her freedom, and she wasn't about to let anything stand in her way. As she neared the back gate, her hands shot out toward the cold metal handle, her fingers barely grazing it before she yanked it open with all her strength. The door groaned under the pressure, but it opened, a sliver of the outside world finally within her reach. But she didn't stop there. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. Lena raced through the open door, past the first layer of guards who were still trying to process the chaos, and into the open air. The rush of freedom hit her all at once, the air fresher and sweeter than anything she had ever breathed inside those walls. She didn't look back. She knew the road ahead was still dangerous, that her escape wasn't guaranteed, but she also knew something that no one could take from her now. She had taken the first step to freedom, and nothing could stop her. Ethan watched her go, his eyes wide in disbelief. He had seen many things in his career, but nothing like this. Lena Harper was no longer just a fugitive. She was a symbol, a living embodiment of defiance. And as he stood there in the midst of the wreckage, watching her run toward freedom, he realized that the real battle had only just begun. Lena didn't need to look back. She had made it, and she wasn't going to stop. Lena sprinted down the dark hallway, her heart set on freedom, her eyes blazing with a fire that only grew stronger with every step. There was only one goal now, freedom. But just as she neared the exit, a figure emerged from the shadows, Jasper Kane. He stood there, his eyes wide with madness, his grip tight on the gun in his hand. "You thought you could escape, Harper?" he sneered, his voice low and seething with venom. Lena didn't slow down. She immediately realized this was not just a simple escape. This was a battle she had to win, a battle against the man who had caused her pain, who had driven her to the edge of despair. He was not the only one with the power over life and death. She had the right to decide too. Jasper raised the gun, his hands shaking with fury, but Lena was faster than a lightning strike. She rushed at him, dodging the first few shots, her hand closing tightly around a shard of glass. With a powerful punch and then a swift slash of the shard, the blade she had once been tortured with now used to repay the very cruelty he had inflicted on her. The knife tore through Jasper's body, and he crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from the wound, a grim symbol of retribution. He gasped, his eyes wide not with fear, but with stunned disbelief. Lena stood over him, the blade still in her hand, her face devoid of any emotion. She looked into his eyes, her voice low but unwavering. "This is justice." That single sentence marked the end of it all, a declaration of victory for herself and for all the victims who had never been given the chance to reclaim justice. As the guard fell to the ground, blood dripping from him onto the cold floor, it was more than just a sign of death. It was a mark that could never be erased. The image of this moment, Lena Harper, the woman who had once been forced to endure the sins of others, would be burned into the minds of all who witnessed it. A moment of defiance, a moment of fearlessness, a warrior standing firm on the foundation of justice, with nothing left to lose. In the dimly lit room, Lena Harper stood amid a pile of documents, her hand clutching the remote that would play the video. The screen before her flickered to life, and the horrifying images began to appear. Footage of Hayes accepting bribes, documents stained with blood from the innocent victims he had abandoned. With every clip, every piece of paper, the undeniable evidence of the corruption in the system he had built became clearer. Lena didn't look back, knowing that everything she had prepared would be the most powerful blow to Hayes's empire. Her eyes burned with determination, but deep within, she felt the weight of the pain of those who had lost everything because of men like Hayes. She pressed the button to play the video, and the live broadcast began immediately, streaming across the world. The entire globe was watching. The footage, testimonies, and evidence of the wrongful cases were now public. Not only was it a powerful strike against Malcolm Hayes, but it was also a declaration to anyone who dared to believe they could trample on justice without consequence. The older audience sitting in front of the screen had tears streaming down their faces, moved deeply. They were the ones who had lived through the darkest years of injustice, of racial discrimination. The price of freedom, of fairness, had been too high for them. The pain, the bloodshed, and the tears of the past were now, through the truth being revealed, washed away like a river sweeping away all the dirt. Lena didn't feel any sense of glory or triumph in this moment. Instead, she only felt the peace of a battle well fought, knowing that justice had finally found its way home. And in that small refuge of a room, amidst the images of cruelty and suffering, Lena realized that justice might take a long time to arrive, but when it does, it will never give up. The crowd packed tightly around Atlanta's International Airport, their applause and cheers echoing through the vast space. Malcolm Hayes was escorted through the crowd by FBI agents, his hands shackled, his pace slow and deliberate, like a defeated man. His once confident eyes were now empty, no longer carrying the arrogance he had flaunted in the courtroom. Every step he took felt heavier than the weight of his own crimes. He scanned the crowd, but all he saw were hostile faces, eyes filled with hatred, and whispers of disdain. No one stood by him anymore. The empire he had so carefully built had crumbled to dust in the blink of an eye. Outside, Lena stood in the heart of Atlanta Square. Though the wound on her shoulder still bled, she felt no pain. The feeling of triumph, the nearness of freedom, made her forget the ache in her body. The soft glow of the setting sun reflected on her face, casting a golden hue that made her appear like a warrior standing tall on the bloodied ground. Her gaze drifted toward the horizon, her eyes no longer simply full of determination, but now of the belief that justice had truly prevailed. She turned to face the crowd gathered around her, the Black community, those who had endured years of suffering and injustice. Lena smiled faintly, then slowly spoke, her voice clear and powerful. Justice doesn't come from above, but from those who dare to shed blood to claim it. Her words resonated like a proclamation, like a challenge to all those who had ever believed they could trample on human rights without consequence. The crowd stood in silence, but within them, a fire burned quietly. They felt the courage, the hunger for justice to triumph, not just through Lena's actions, but through the sacrifice of so many who had been lost in the past. Lena stood there, her gaze focused on the future, but in that moment, she knew her journey wasn't just an end. It was a turning point, a moment that would change not only her life, but the lives of all those who had been oppressed.